reviewing the AMD Threadripper 9980X CPU. This is a $5,000 part, which instantly narrows the viability for who's buying it. And we have a ton of cool production tests for this one, so we sort of used these as an excuse to experiment with a bunch of new types of testing, and that includes things like more medical software testing and more modeling and CFD type of software testing. So that should be pretty interesting for everybody, regardless of whether you're trying to buy a $5,000 CPU. Just some examples. We ran some medical simulations where we saw an 18% uplift in performance generationally over the 7980X, similar to the 18% generational uplift we saw in financial options and Black-Scholes modeling. Further, we ran a convolution benchmark with SpecWorkstation where we saw a 58% improvement over the 7980X. Now, to keep it grounded in reality, in most places the gain is far smaller from one generation to the next, like in compression, where it's like 2 plus or minus percentage points of change. However, from the Zen 5 change to how AVX instructions are handled, it sometimes gains disproportionately. We saw the same actually with the 9900X versus the 7900X, or the X3D variants of the 99 and 79 in AVX heavy scenarios. The quick version up front is that the improvement from the 7980X to the 9980X is anywhere from 2% to 58%, but the vast majority of tests are closer to 5 to 18%, and then most of our sort of standard tests, our non-SpecWorkstation tests, those fall in the range of like 2 to 8% on average generationally from the previous 80X CPU to the current 80X CPU in the 9000 series. So these CPUs today, these are production CPUs that we're focusing on. They are intended for work or for research, medical modeling, financial modeling. People generally use a CPU like this to either make money or make some kind of contribution to science or something like that. So this is very different from our typical desktop CPU benchmarking. We're still benchmarking gaming, but it is far less important. The only real reason we benchmark gaming with Threadripper at this point is to make sure it's just not totally broken. And sometimes it is in years and years past, but lately it's been pretty good. So the focus will mostly be on production tests, with gaming only there to ensure no major broken results. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Montech HSO1 and HSO2 cases. The HSO1 and HSO2 cases differ by way of a mesh front or a curved glass front. We previously reviewed these cases in our intensive benchmarking process and found them to be overall high build quality, with thermals comparable between the two designs. The rear chamber of the case uniquely brings the power supply forward and perforates the rear wall of the case, allowing for more air movement internally while providing a different look. The rear of the case uses a fan mounting mechanism for 2 separate fans that can be coupled together with a plate, improving convenience. The HSO1 and HSO2 also invert with minimal effort, allowing the computer to present to the opposite side without needing to reconfigure the entire build. Learn more at the links in the description below. All right, so these CPUs are expensive. That limits the audience that is interested in buying it or able to buy it. And so what we're doing here is we've rerun all of our tests for CPUs, so it's all new data, and we also added a bunch of new tests. And hopefully what that does is makes it so that if you want to just pause and look at numbers for CPUs that you are interested in, if it's not Threadripper, then those numbers are hopefully there for you, and if not, we're still adding to the database. And it's got new data to look at as well, so there's some new stuff to play around with in terms of evaluating how they perform. Here's a quick recap of the CPU lineup. AMD is launching 2 versions of the Threadripper 9000 CPUs. These include the Pro versions and the non-Pro versions. The Pro CPUs had an earlier embargo. Today we're covering the HEDT, or high-end desktop, non-Pro Threadripper CPUs. The 9980X is a 64-core, 128-thread part that boosts up to 5.4 gigahertz and has 256 megabytes of L3 cache. The CPU sockets into STR5 platforms, and like the other 2 modern Threadripper parts launching with it, it has a 350-watt claimed TDP. It's $5,000 for the 9980X that we're reviewing today. The 9970X is a 32-core, 64-thread part. They all share the same boost of 5.4 gigahertz, but the base clock is higher on the lower core count CPUs and the cheaper CPUs as a result of higher power availability per core based on power budget, and just it's easier to hit stability with fewer cores at a higher clock. Cache is down to 128 megabytes L3 on the 9970X and 9960X, the latter of which is a 24-core, 48-thread part. Pricing is $2,500 for the 9970X and $1,500 for the 9960X. Compared to last time, prices are familiar. They're still high, but they haven't changed. The 7980X was $5,000 last time, the 7970X was $2,500, and the 7960X was $1,500. Threadripper 9000 prices are elevated from several generations back to the 3000 series, but they're the same as the 7000 series. The architectural improvements are the same as the Zen 5 launch. We've got previous videos talking about some of that. The one that'll come up today the most is with the AVX changes, where we were starting to do some digging into specific improvements where they were just ridiculously high generationally for some of these new tests we have. And we spoke with Wendell about some of it from Level 1 Techs as a third party, and we also spoke with AMD engineers about it, including Amit Mehra, who's been on the channel before for some of our engineering discussions. So AMD sent this explanation as a refresher on Zen 5 for one of the results that we're talking about today. Quote, at first glance, the test does appear to benefit from AVX 512 since the code has multiple references to ZMM. The main difference in 7000 and 9000 is the double versus single pump, 256-bit native versus 512-bit native. AMD also said, quote, high level, it took 2 cycles to do a 512-bit operation on Zen 4, but 1 cycle on Zen 5 because we doubled the FP data path width and increased the bandwidth from the L2 to the core to be able to match that speed up. You can't always take advantage of it, but theoretically, there's a 2x improvement, end quote. Now, in some, there is a very large uplift, like that 58% number we looked at. This is not special to Threadripper. This is specific to Zen 5 versus Zen 4. So it's specifically those two compared against each other. That could include desktop as well. That was true in the past with the 9700X, for example, also. As for the test bench for this, our chart subtitles apply to the desktop platforms, but the Threadripper CPUs are tested with different memory and different motherboards. It deviates from some of the other benches, obviously, so we'll put that information on the screen now if you want to see what parts we used. And now we get to the fun part, which is I am calling you all out. I'm calling out the audience. Again, this is 2 Threadripper reviews in a row because we can see viewer retention charts. That's right. We know what you're watching in our videos. And the highest spike, the last 2 Threadripper reviews now, including the one where I called the audience out for this last time, has been a spike to the gaming charts. So if you jump to the gaming charts, I'm going to know. And like, just to be really clear for everybody again, the gaming stuff, it is important just to make sure it's not broken, because you want to still be able to play games in a lot of cases on these CPUs. But it's really not the focus. And just to be, like, in all sincerity, to be clear with people who maybe don't know this, these are not CPUs you buy for gaming-focused builds. If you want a gaming-focused PC build and you're not really doing a bunch of this kind of work with it, do not buy Threadripper. It is a massive waste of money. It's going to be worse than something like a 9800X 3D, which is far cheaper and also better at gaming. But Threadripper does stuff that the 9800X 3D can't. So there's a kind of a line of what they do. Anyway, that's just every time I look at it, I'm like, I wonder what people watch the most of these Threadripper reviews. Yep, it's gaming, but that's okay because the channel's called Gamers Nexus, so I kind of get it. We're part of the problem, and that's okay. All right, let's get started with some production benchmarks. 7-zip compression is up now. This test is measured in MIPS, or millions of instructions per second. Higher is better throughput. The 9980X is the new chart topper here at 520,000 MIPS versus the 7980X is 508,000 MIPS. The improvement is just 2.3% here, so this is one of the lower improvements. We have some that are way higher. We have some that are lower still than this. There's clear benefit to higher core count overall in this test. The 7980X over the 7970X previously held a lead of 34% or 67% over the 7960X. Against the highest end desktop part, the 9950X 3D, the 9980X sees an improvement of 151%. Notably, extra cache seems to help here. Both the 7950X 3D and the 9950X 3D are benefited over the 9950X. Threadripper is in an entirely different class from desktop components, although the uplift over the last generation 7980X is limited and pretty boring here. In decompression, the 9980X scaled up to 926,000 MIPS, gaining 8% on the 7980X's 857,000 MIPS. This is a better showing than what we saw in compression and posts better scaling. The rest of the lineup is familiar to the prior examples. Extra cache, however, in this one doesn't help as much as in the previous compression test, as the 7950X 3D is now below the 9950X non-3D. This would align with the benefit of providing more of an uplift on Threadripper as well. SpecWorkstation 4.0 is next. This runs a number of simulations and mathematical models that we aren't experts in, but we can at least run the benchmarks and know how to set them up. We'll rely on the Spec website to explain what the tests are. The first is options pricing, and this is something we've run before and many of you in our audience have appreciated, so we brought it back. The website says that this runs Monte Carlo probabilistic simulations for financial uncertainty. It also runs Black-Scholes pricing models for theoretical value and binomial options pricing. We're not experts in how these are used, but we know what some of those words mean, and those of you in our audience who are experts have repeatedly expressed an appreciation for this test, so here it is. The results have the 9980X at the top with a 7.8 score. That has it improved on the 7980X by a much more impressive 18% as compared to the 7-zip tests, aligning with the findings of the 9000 series desktop parts against the 7000 series in this same test. You can see that, an example, the 9800X3D against the 7800X3D, or the 9900X3D versus the 7900X3D. There is an architectural benefit here. It's one of the rare breakouts for Zen 5 that we talked about after the initial round of reviews when we had validated it as a legitimate deviation. The 9980X improves on the highest end desktop 9950X3D by 200%, basically being the difference between being runnable and not. Threadripper really makes an impact here, and the generational gain is real, but rare in this one test. OpenFOAM is next. Per the spec website, OpenFOAM is a CFD test that, quote, performs 2D Reynolds averaged simulation for fluid dynamics analysis, end quote. It also runs a solver test. The 9980X scores 23.3 here, leading the 7980X prior generation by about 9%. It's not as impressive as options pricing, but better than some of the other tests we have today. The lead over the desktop parts, like the 9950X and X3D, is enough that it's not really in the same class, with multiples of uplift in some cases. Convolution testing is next. Spec says that this test applies, quote, a convolution filter to an image, a critical operation in signal processing and image analysis for edge detection and feature extraction. It also says that it's heavily multi-threaded. Here's the chart. In this test, the 9980X scored 9.3 to the 7980X's 5.9. That is a massive uplift of 58%, and initially meant that we eliminated the test entirely because it just didn't align with anything else at all. This is completely out of alignment with other tests, but it's not totally unbelievable. We contacted a few people, including Wendell of Level 1 Techs. We also spoke with AMD's engineers, which gave us a neutral third party from Wendell, and of course a conflicted first party for a check of why this might happen. Wendell noted that this is expected behavior and had seen similar results in other tests, believing it to be related to AVX improvements in addition to being a test that runs long enough to benefit from them, as opposed to something that runs much quicker and is a shorter time period. AMD noted that it has also seen results around 60% for certain similar tests, so it's not completely out of believability, but this is a rare occurrence. Although we have our 9970X review coming up separately, we'll just put it in this one, and we'll note that it also saw a 56% improvement here over the 7970X predecessor. So the results align generationally. Looking at last gen, the 9950X improved on the 7950X also by 50%. This is consistent, and that also supports that this isn't some one-off bad result, but rather it is a repeatable finding. Whether or not it applies in the real world is maybe a different story. We're not sure about that. We could use some of the audience help on that one. The results appear to be consistent and are present across numerous CPUs cross-generation, which means the only thing left to consider is that real-world premise. And this particular test exits our expertise, as we don't do signal processing or image analysis work, at least not like this. And we'd love to hear from those of you in our audience as to whether the spec convolution test aligns with your real-world applications that you use in your work life that do these things. Regardless, the result's repeatable, and so whether this is a micro benchmark that's synthetic or something that scales to real-world use, it is an actual gain. LAMMPS testing is next. According to spec, this test is for large-scale atomic and molecular massively parallel simulation, which spec says, quote, utilizes MPI to scale to multiple cores to perform complex simulations, end quote. This includes the life science subtests, such as for polymer chain calculations and protein calculations for what we assume are medical uses. LAMMPS has the 9980X at a 5.5 score in spec, leading the 7980X by 17%. This is close to the options pricing results. Although spec has several tests where there's no real impact, like Handbrake, it also has a higher saturation of tests with larger generational improvements. The spec data science test is next. Spec says that this test, quote, involves running a series of synthetic benchmarks that simulate real-world AI and machine learning workflows using the Python-based data science libraries Pandas, scikit-learn, and XGBoost, end quote. Generationally, the 9980X improves on the 7980X by 10%, going from 2.0 to 2.2 in the scoring. For reference, the 9950X improved on the 7950X by 13% at 1.7 from 1.5, so generationally this aligns. AMD is next, another test our viewers liked last time, notably those of you in the medical fields. This is a molecular dynamics simulator for modeling, quote, behavior of biomolecular systems, end quote, with specs saying that it's used for, quote, research in biochemistry, pharmacology, and molecular biology, end quote. The 9980X scored 6.0, with the 7980X at 5.1. This is an improvement of almost 18%, which aligns again with the LAMMPS and the options pricing benchmarks. We have a lot more spec results, it's a huge suite, but we'll close on one that's less interesting to bring it back down to earth and balance the higher results. This is for RodiniaCFD, which the site explains has a pre-Euler subtest that, quote, executes an unstructured grid finite volume CFD, or computational fluid dynamics solver, for 3D Euler equations for compressible flow, end quote. The 9980X scored 3.7 here, with the 7980X at 3.5. This is one where the improvement is less exciting and back down to about 5 to 6% improvement generationally. Up next is Chromium Code Compile. There are a lot of types of code compile, just like there are a lot of types of video encoding or photo editing or 3D rendering workloads, so we're just representing one here as we do with any other production test. The 9980X completes the compile the fastest at 48 minutes total. The compile time is 7.5% reduced from the 7980X. Elsewhere, with the newer version of this test, we're seeing reduced impact compared to prior test iterations. The 7980X and 7970X are relatively close to each other, with the 9950X 3D and 9950X non-3D also near each other. Some of these CPUs are running with reduced memory speed as they require higher memory capacity and had more trouble holding our usual settings, so those are noted where true. Now, for the Threadripper parts, we're using 128 gigabytes of memory, so this is not a problem there. And for the others, we've noted where we've expanded the capacity and had to reduce the speed. The 14900K is Intel's best performer, requiring 100 minutes to complete the compile. The 9950X outperforms this. Blender tile-based rendering is up next. For this process, the 9980X is the new chart topper at 2.1 minutes to complete a render of a single frame from the GN intro logo animation. The next fastest is the 7980X at 2.5 minutes, which makes sense. This is heavily thread dependent, so threads will outrank frequency where large differences emerge. Intel's newer generation does okay in this test, with the 285K between the 9950X and 7950X. It's also one of the tests where Intel doesn't see regressive performance, though we still wouldn't recommend a 285K, especially because that entire platform is dead anyway. Adobe Photoshop is next, tested with the Puget Suite. This uses an aggregate score of filters, resizes, and other functions within Photoshop. The best performer here is the 9950X, followed by other desktop CPUs. The Threadripper parts fall further down the chart, with the 9980X in particular underperforming. We've seen this in the past, such as with the 7980X. They have too many threads for their own good here, and Photoshop just isn't able to utilize them in this testing. The 7980X is outperformed by the 7970X and 7960X, so the 9980X landing in the middle isn't a surprise. Its main improvement comes from the frequency. It does okay here if this is just one of many applications you use, but if Photoshop is sort of the only thing you do, then there are better and cheaper CPUs for the job. Adobe Premiere is next, our best frenemy that we see every day. In this one, the 9980X improves upon the performance from the 7980X and 7970X, but only barely. It's definitely not worth a single generational upgrade, though we generally don't ever recommend that anyway. It's been extremely rare that we've done so. The improvement is almost 5% from the 7980X to the 9980X in the extended score for Premiere. Intel's 285K trails most Threadripper CPUs in the chart and roughly ties the 7960X. It also technically outperforms the 9950X. Intel's biggest advantage remains in its quick sync solution with the IGP, which would show up disproportionately in more targeted tests rather than the full sweep being done here. Threadripper does well overall here and is at least better than its Photoshop showing. But without other applications leaning on threads, a desktop CPU would get most of the same performance. The best use for Threadripper here would be assigning its excess threads to other tasks, like separate audio compositing and other software while running Premiere tasks or something like that. It gets into some manual thread management work. DaVinci Resolve is next. We haven't tested this in years, so this is an experimental chart. In this test, the 9980X's frequency boost allows it to gain on prior Threadripper CPUs. The previous lineup had the 7960X and 7980X tied, with the 7970X marginally ahead. We saw this with the 7000 series Threadripper reviews, where 64-core parts sometimes caused slight losses compared to 32-core parts. The 285K falls behind the 9950X in this one, though not by a lot, with the 14900K roughly within rerun distance of the 285K. Threadripper is at least the best performer here as well, despite not providing clear value over the desktop parts. It's just not built for these kinds of workloads, or maybe you could say these workloads aren't built for it, but it still being at least technically the best is important. And that's not the case in gaming. We'll keep gaming short. The only purpose of gaming tests on Threadripper generally is to make sure that there isn't some major problem where they're just totally unrunnable, but cheaper desktop parts are going to be better for pure gaming builds for a lot of reasons, not just the money, but they're actually better. Threadripper is actually detrimental if all you do is gaming. In gaming, you're also going to notice that the Threadripper CPUs don't always follow a strictly logical order, especially when they're within a few frames per second of each other. That's because of the increase in run-to-run variance in at least some of these games, causing less meaningful average results. In other words, running it even more times, and we already do at least 4 passes, could shuffle the lineup again. Stellaris simulation time is first. The 9800X 3D is the current leader at 37.1 seconds on average for simulation time. The 9700X follows this at 43.2 seconds, benefiting from Zen 5 architectural improvements over the prior generation. The 285K isn't what we'd call good here, but at least it matches its predecessor. Threadripper is way at the bottom, with the 9980X at least improving on the 7980X notably, but it's still far worse than any other modern gaming CPU. The 5700X actually is nearly at the level of the 9980X. It's just detrimental to have this CPU configuration for this game, which isn't really news to anyone, or it shouldn't be. The CPU can at least play games, but the difference in simulation time between the 9800X 3D and the 9980X would be noticeable in real gameplay. You would definitely feel that difference. Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail is next. The 9980X and 7980X high core count CPUs had some major inconsistency issues in this game, so there's an asterisk next to their entries. We're still showing the averages of 4 runs, it's just that the runs are more variable than typically. The 9980X, for instance, had a range from 274 to 248 FPS average, which is a huge swing. Our typical standard deviation in this game is a couple frames per second for the average, not 30 or 25 or whatever. The game was playable, but all over the place for the average frame rate. Lows were worse overall as well, but again, technically playable. This is why we test games with Threadripper though. It clearly has some scheduling issues here, but it's not like it breaks the playability. In Dragon's Dogma 2 at 1080p, the Threadripper CPUs end up in the lower half of the chart. The 9980X is worse than the 7950X here, and about the same as the 7970X. The 7980X was below the 7960X and the 7970X, indicating that these extremely high core counts are detrimental to gaming performance. The higher frequency matters more than the extra cores, so the trade-offs are harmful to gaming performance here. This has been true forever with Threadripper, so none of this is news. What matters more is that they're still playable. Threadripper does suffer from worse lows, particularly 0.1%, but not so bad that they render the game stuttery. You can still play on a Threadripper system, it's just that gaming-only users should buy something else. Cyberpunk is next. In this one, the 9980X outperforms the 7980X on a technicality, but both are closer to the R7 2700 than they are to the 9800X 3D. The run-to-run consistency was fine, with the 9980X only exhibiting a less than 2 FPS average standard deviation, so it's not like what we saw in Final Fantasy. It's just not particularly good. This is still passable in frame rate in the context of a computer built for specific work tasks that can still play games sometimes when needed. It passes that need. In Baldur's Gate 3, the 9980X ends up around the levels of the 265K, which is really just more embarrassing for Intel than anything else. We already know Threadripper isn't particularly good at gaming, despite being okay at it, but the 265K really should be doing better here. This is also a game where the 285K was hugely regressive at 109 FPS average against the 14700K's 117 or the 14900K's 123. We did test other games. They're just not relevant beyond proving the point we've already proven, which is that Threadripper is passable if gaming is not your primary need. It's just not the best choice for it, which everybody has known for many generations now. And if you're new here, then that's important to know anyway. This next chart shows the power consumption as measured at the EPS 12-volt cables with a power interposer between the motherboard and power supply. Tested with an all-core workload in Blender, we observed stable and consistent power draw across both the 7980X and the 9980X CPUs, with the new 9980X measuring at 371 watts from the 354 watts on the last-gen Threadripper flagship. It's a lot of power to cool. It's also about a 20-watt increase or so, and this is at the EPS 12-volt cable, so that means it's not at the wall, but it also means that it is before VRM efficiency losses. This also doesn't show transients. This chart shows the thermal behavior of the 9980X using the Silverstone 360mm liquid cooler with a Threadripper-sized cold plate for this, as we showed in our bench specs table earlier, so the results are not comparable to our 7980X review thermal results from its launch a couple years ago. Also, as usual, thermal testing is best done with lots of coolers compared and noise normalized. That would be a cooler benchmark though. There's a CPU review. So to keep things simple, we're just looking at the basic numbers here. The 9980X under an all-core workload ran at around 58 degrees Celsius when running the relatively loud 100% fan speeds on the 360ml liquid cooler. This chart shows thermals at steady state across the various CCDs. The CCD to CCD delta here is 6.7 degrees Celsius at 49.7 to 56.1 degrees in an ambient of 21 degrees Celsius plus or minus 1C. Generally speaking, this can be cooled at lower noise levels with the 360mm coolers like this one with a Threadripper size plate especially, without any major issues if assuming a well-ventilated case. The surface area is so huge on this CPU that the power is distributed across a large area, making it easier to cool than a 200-watt heat load would be on a normal desktop-sized Ryzen CPU with 2 CCDs. With all cores working, the CPU typically ran at around 3950 MHz, with occasional spikes to 4200 MHz, while some threads were bringing in data or just sitting and waiting for new tiles to render. The base clock is 3.2 GHz, so it's not dropping that low during this particular workload, but it's also far away from the 5.4 GHz that is listed as the high end on the spec sheet. This is typical behavior, though, for all core workloads. This chart shows the 7980X for the same test. The frequency bottoms out at around 3.7 GHz, but is all over the place during this workload. The 9980X has improved upon the frequency in all core scenarios overall. In a single-threaded test with Cinebench, the 9980X ran at 5425 MHz, exceeding the spec listing of the 5.4 GHz for boost. This is also expected behavior with more limited load boosting higher. The 7980X in the same test ran at about 5340 MHz, so the single thread frequency has improved generationally, but not much, and that's why some benchmarks only show a couple percentage points of change. Getting to the wrap up then, so on the gaming side, just to clear that first, the same problems exist as last time, which is sometimes there are issues with consistency where run to run you don't get the same experience. There's far more deviation in average frame rate, and a lot of that is derived from the fact that there is also more top to bottom scale on the low. So in other words, the frame time consistency is worse. It's less consistent on Threadripper than with desktop parts. And that's especially true with 64-core Threadripper CPUs. So this is not really unexpected. These high core count CPUs, even in applications that aren't games, sometimes they just have so many cores that it starts causing scheduling problems. The application doesn't know what to do with them. Or you end up in a situation where because the clock isn't boosting as high because of the higher core count, as opposed to a lower core count desktop part, you're losing that frequency advantage too. So it's not unexpected. The good news is the games we tested this time aren't broken, so they run, and they weren't like awful experiences. They weren't big stuttery messes like has been true in the earliest Threadripper generations, like the 1000 series of Zen Threadripper parts. But they're not as good, obviously, as other components. Now onto the stuff that matters for Threadripper. So first of all, just like last time with the 64 versus 32 core parts, the 64 core CPU runs technically cooler than the 32 core, and that's because if you take the same power and you distribute it across more area, more silicon, there's a lot of die on this, for example, dummy piece of silicon from a previous generation, you distribute it across more dies, and you're going to get lower temperatures per die per hotspot. So that remains true here, where the 64 core technically can be cooler than the 32 core. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that hasn't really changed otherwise. Additionally, with the prices, these are not something that you're buying for value, if you're buying it at all. The target buyer for these CPUs is probably making money with their computer. It's also possible that a company is buying it. And so these are way past diminishing returns on any value scale curve. Desktop parts balance way better there. Now, Threadripper has a benefit as well of PCIe lane availability for machines with multiple accelerators or a lot of I/O, stuff that you get limited on in a desktop. And then 64 core doesn't always scale well. This was true last time, also last several times, where sometimes the 32 core can be a better fit. So do research online. A great example of this is in Adobe Premiere, for example, where last time we found that a 32 core would make more sense for us if we were to switch to Threadripper for video production purposes than a 64 core. So sometimes the 32 is better. It really depends on the application. Hopefully we have something in our test suite that represents what you do. And if not, there's a lot of reviews out there. If you're spending this kind of money on this stuff, absolutely go look up other reviews, like even if we have represented it, because it's just too much money to spend to only look at one. So, you know, the benchmarks are like a slice of the type of workload, and there's a lot of types of workload within a subset. Even just compile, for example, or video editing, photo editing, whatever, there's a lot of ways to do a thing. Get as much data as you can on it if you're spending this kind of money. Otherwise, that's it for this one. That's all the numbers for you. Hopefully that helps if you're actually in the market for one of these, and if not, hopefully it was kind of cool to see how it performs. We have a bunch of new tests that we've done as a result of this CPU, so it pushed us to try some new things, which is cool, and we're going to implement those in our more normal desktop CPU reviews as well. So like the 9950X, for example, or like a 265K, 285K, whatever, and that'll be there going forward as a result of this review. So we've got the process now. Now it's just a matter of refining the tests and kind of getting them where we're comfortable with them in terms of understanding the variability and things like that. So that's cool stuff on our side just for benchmarking. It's kind of fun. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly, like the time that we spend benchmarking and reviewing these components. Or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to throw a few bucks our way. Thank you for watching. We'll see you all next time.